On a bitter February morning in 1958, silence ruled the stone corridors of St. Bartholomew's Monastery, not as a simple absence of sound, but as a presence so complete that it shaped every movement, every breath, and every passing hour within its walls. The monastery stood far from cities and highways, far from radios, political speeches, and the anxious rhythm of modern life, existing instead in a slower world where time was measured by bells rather than clocks, and where repetition was not monotony but devotion. Morning prayer gave way to quiet labor dissolved into evening reflection, and each day followed the same deliberate pattern, unchanged by the headlines that unsettled the world beyond the hills surrounding the monastery grounds. Deep beneath those grounds, below thick stone walls that had survived centuries of wars, revolutions, and shifting empires, there was a basement library that few visitors ever saw, and even fewer truly understood. It was dimly lit, perpetually cool, and meticulously ordered, with long rows of shelves holding volumes whose spines bore the marks of age rather than neglect, their pages preserved by hands that treated books not as objects but as responsibilities. And this library was the domain of Sister Mary Catherine. She had worked there for more than a decade, and she knew the space with an intimacy that bordered on instinct, knowing which shelves bowed under the weight of history, which manuscripts required gloves, and how the pale winter light shifted through the narrow windows as the day slowly surrendered to evening. For her, this place was not a retreat from the world, but a carefully chosen distance from it, a space where clarity could exist without noise. And on that particular morning, nothing suggested that her life, defined by routine and restraint, was about to intersect with forces far beyond the monastery's walls. The boxes had arrived 3 days earlier, stacked neatly near the entrance of the library, plain cardboard containers, bearing no markings that would suggest importance or urgency, their anonymity consistent with countless other donations the monastery had received over the years. They came from the estate of a recently deceased man, a former government official, whose name held no significance for the sisters who received the shipment, and whose life, at least on the surface, appeared unremarkable in the quiet records accompanying the donation. Such contributions were common, particularly from retired professionals who believed that religious institutions offered a more dignified resting place for their personal libraries than attics, basements, or secondhand bookstores. Sister Mary Catherine had cataloged hundreds of such collections during her years as librarian, approaching each one with the same disciplined method she applied to every task, never assuming importance, but never dismissing it either.
She expected this collection to be no different. At 42 years old, Sister Mary Catherine was not a woman who sought surprises, nor was she inclined toward imagination for its own sake, having shaped her life around order, repetition, and careful observation. She had been born Catherine Kowalski to Polish immigrant parents who settled near the steel mills of Buffalo, where discipline was not a philosophical choice, but a practical necessity tied to survival, work, and education. Her father labored with machines that demanded precision and attention, while her mother worked with fabric, stitching garments with an accuracy that left little room for error. And from both of them, Catherine absorbed an unspoken respect for systems that worked only when each part performed its role correctly. As a child, she showed an unusual aptitude for recognizing patterns, whether in numbers, language, or structure, and by her early teenage years she moved comfortably between Polish at home, English at school, and Latin learned through quiet study, not as an act of rebellion or ambition, but out of curiosity and discipline. Her teachers encouraged her toward a future in academia, convinced that her mind belonged in universities and lecture halls, yet she chose a different path, not because she lacked ability, but because she believed that stillness itself could hold purpose. She entered the monastery on the eve of the Second World War, at a moment when the world outside fractured under the weight of ideology and violence, while her own life narrowed into something quieter, more focused, and deliberately removed from the chaos. Yet even within those walls, the war made itself felt. Universities evacuated archives, churches safeguarded manuscripts, and libraries became temporary vaults for materials considered too valuable or too sensitive to be lost. And during those years, Sister Mary Catherine learned a lesson few people ever encountered firsthand. She learned that books could be dangerous, not because of what they declared openly, but because of what they could conceal. By 1958, the war had ended, but its shadow remained firmly in place, reshaped into something colder and less visible, manifesting not in armies, but in suspicion, secrecy, and quiet rivalry. Newspapers spoke of spies uncovered in ordinary neighborhoods, of betrayals hidden behind respectable professions, and of secrets passed not through dramatic exchanges, but through methods so subtle they often went unnoticed. The Cold War had taught America that enemies no longer announced themselves, that they did not wear uniforms or march under banners, but instead lived unremarkable lives, carried briefcases, and blended into institutions that rely on trust. Sister Mary Catherine read these stories with detached curiosity, never imagining that such matters could intersect with her own carefully ordered existence.
Until she reached the fourth box. She worked through the collection methodically, lifting each book, checking its binding, recording publication details, and noting any marginalia that might hold historical relevance, her movements unhurried and precise. Most volumes were predictable, consisting of history, political theory, and religious works that reflected a lifetime spent in policy circles and academic interest, some bearing neat annotations written with the confidence of someone accustomed to analysis rather than reflection. Nothing appeared unusual. Then she reached a leather-bound Bible. It stood out immediately, not because it was rare or ornate, but because it bore unmistakable signs of use, with a cracked spine, softened page edges, and a weight that suggested it had been handled often rather than displayed. This was not a ceremonial object, it was a working book. She paused longer than usual before opening it, aware without fully understanding why her attention lingered. Inside the cover, she found a simple bookplate, and beneath it a brief inscription, formal in tone, restrained in language, and signed only with a first name, offering nothing that would, on its own, justify concern. Yet as she began turning the pages, something subtle began to register. At first, it was easy to dismiss, a faint impression that appeared only when the page caught the light at a certain angle, so pale it seemed more pressed into the paper than drawn on it. She adjusted the lamp slightly and looked again, noticing a lightly marked word that did not correspond to any verse typically emphasized for study or devotion. She continued turning pages, telling herself it was nothing unusual, reminding herself that people marked books in countless personal ways, and that she had seen every imaginable system during her years as librarian. Then she found another, and another. Always faint, always precise, and always isolated from the surrounding text in a way that resisted any obvious spiritual or theological logic. She sat back slightly in her chair, the Bible resting open before her, as the quiet of the monastery pressed in around her, unchanged and indifferent to the shift that had begun to take place in her thoughts. Sister Mary Catherine did not consider herself a suspicious person, nor was she inclined toward dramatic conclusions, but she trusted patterns deeply, and this pattern lacked any devotional coherence she could recognize. These were not passages of comfort, instruction, or moral emphasis, but scattered words that appeared disconnected, technical, and oddly deliberate in their placement. She told herself she would return to the matter later, making a small notation in the catalog ledger and placing a paper marker at the top of the page. Yet even as she considered closing the book, she found that she could not bring herself to do so. The simplest choice would have been to shelve the Bible, record it as another donated volume, and allow it to disappear into the quiet anonymity of the library. But simplicity had never meant carelessness to her. She remembered something Sister Agatha, the monastery's former librarian, had once told her during the war years, when fear and uncertainty had briefly entered even this secluded place. Most dangerous things, the old woman had said, do not announce themselves. They wait to be overlooked. Sister Mary Catherine reached for her notebook and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page, February 18th, 1958, followed by a single line written with deliberate restraint. Bible, unusual markings, further examination required. She did not yet know why she felt compelled to write it, only that ignoring it was no longer an option. She had no way of knowing that this small decision, made in a basement library far removed from politics, power, and public life, had already placed her on the edge of a hidden conflict that had been unfolding for years. A conflict fought without uniforms, without battlefields, and without witnesses. A war designed to remain invisible, and certainly not one that was ever meant to pass through a monastery library.
Sister Mary Catherine did not approach the Bible again with curiosity, but with a discipline shaped by years of quiet labor, years in which emotion was something to be acknowledged but never allowed to lead, especially when judgment was required. She repositioned the lamp on her desk, adjusting it carefully until the faint pencil impressions became visible only at a precise angle, an angle that suggested the markings had been made by someone who understood exactly how easily they could escape notice. This was not the work of habit, nor of casual study, and certainly not the mark of someone seeking spiritual guidance in moments of doubt or reflection. She began again from the first page, turning slowly, deliberately, resisting the urge to read, and instead allowing her eyes to scan for irregularities, for anything that broke the uniformity of printed scripture. It took time, and she accepted that without impatience, understanding that careful work often demanded patience, not as a virtue, but as a method. Word by word, page by page, the markings revealed themselves, each one subtle, restrained, and placed with a consistency that felt increasingly difficult to dismiss. They were not clustered, they were not sequential, they were distributed in a way that suggested intention rather than emphasis. She began to copy them into her notebook, recording each word exactly as it appeared, along with its location in the text, writing down the book, chapter, and verse with the same precision she used when cataloging medieval manuscripts. At first, the list felt meaningless.
A collection of terms without context, without obvious connection, and without any theological structure she could recognize. She told herself that this was exactly what she should expect if she was over-interpreting something ordinary, that her mind, trained to recognize patterns, might be imposing significance where none existed. Yet even as she considered that possibility, the list continued to grow, and with it, her unease. The words themselves were troubling, not because they were alarming, but because they were strangely out of place, appearing in passages where they served no spiritual purpose, and where their isolation seemed deliberate rather than accidental. They were nouns more often than verbs, and rarely descriptive in a devotional sense, lacking the emotional weight one would expect from someone marking scripture for guidance, comfort, or contemplation. She paused often, resting her eyes, allowing the quiet of the library to reassert itself. But each time she returned to the task, the same conclusion pressed gently against her thoughts. This was not random, yet it was not meaningful in any way she could immediately understand. By late afternoon, the winter light filtering through the narrow windows had faded into a dull gray, and the heating pipes in the walls began their familiar rhythmic knocking, a sound she had long associated with the transition from day into evening. She closed the Bible briefly and leaned back in her chair, looking down at the list she had compiled so far, hoping that distance might reveal a pattern she had missed. It did not. The words remained stubbornly disconnected, resisting interpretation, and that, more than anything else, unsettled her. During her years as librarian, Sister Mary Catherine had encountered many personal systems of notation, some elaborate, some eccentric, and some so idiosyncratic they could only be understood by the person who created them. But even the most personal systems carried internal logic, a sense of coherence that revealed itself through repetition or structure. This list did not. Instead, it felt deliberately incomplete, as though each word served a purpose only when paired with something else that was not present. She considered the possibility that the markings had been made by someone other than the Bible's most recent owner, perhaps a previous reader whose identity had been lost over time. Yet even that explanation failed to satisfy her, as the consistency of pressure, placement, and restraint suggested a single hand, working with careful intention. She thought briefly of marginalia scholars who tracked linguistic patterns or word frequencies, but the selection here did not align with such methods, nor did it reflect any academic project she recognized.
It was only when she turned her attention to the recorded locations of the words, rather than the words themselves, that a new possibility began to form, quietly and without urgency. She looked again at the columns in her notebook. Book, chapter, verse, numbers. She frowned slightly, not in alarm, but in concentration, as her mind shifted from language to structure, from meaning to placement. The thought was tentative, almost unwelcome, and she resisted it at first, reminding herself that speculation without evidence was not analysis, and that imagination was a poor substitute for discipline. Still, the idea lingered, not as a conclusion, but as a question. What if the words were not meant to be read in the order they appeared? She set the notebook aside
and began a new page, rewriting several entries, this time arranging them not by their appearance in the Bible, but by their numerical references, listing the chapter and verse side by side, and studying them as values rather than locations. The numbers at first glance offered no clarity. They did not progress sequentially. They did not repeat in obvious patterns. They did not cluster around specific sections of the text. For nearly an hour, she tried several approaches, testing possibilities methodically, arranging the entries alphabetically, then by book order, then by frequency, and each time arriving at the same frustrating result. Nothing resolved, nothing aligned. Each attempt ended in the same quiet confusion, forcing her to acknowledge a growing discomfort, not because she feared what the markings might represent, but because she could not yet rule out the possibility that she was misinterpreting something entirely innocent. The idea that she might be imposing significance where none existed troubled her deeply, as it challenged the very discipline she relied upon in her work. She closed the notebook and considered stopping for the evening. The bell for Vespers would ring soon, calling the sisters to prayer, and the rhythm of the day would continue as it always had. Yet she remained seated, her attention drawn back to the Bible with a persistence that felt less like curiosity and more like obligation. It was then that memory intervened, quietly and without drama, surfacing not as an image, but as a fragment of information she had absorbed years earlier and never expected to recall. During the early years of the Cold War, the monastery library had received several academic journals from Catholic universities, journals that included discussions of censorship, information control, and the ways texts had been used historically to conceal prohibited material during periods of political repression. She remembered reading, almost absent-mindedly at the time, an article describing how published books had once been used as reference keys, allowing hidden messages to be constructed without writing them explicitly.
The concept had seemed abstract, almost academic, and she had not thought of it again until now. Sitting alone in the library, surrounded by shelves of carefully preserved volumes, that abstract idea took on a different quality. She did not think, not yet, of espionage. She thought of concealment, of systems designed not to communicate openly, but to hide in plain sight. She returned to the notebook and looked again at the numbers. This time, she added a small calculation beside several entries, summing the chapter and verse values together without any clear expectation of result. The sums varied. Some were low, some higher. Most fell into a narrow range. She stared at the list for several moments, then shook her head slightly, frustrated with herself for chasing what felt like an increasingly tenuous line of thought. Still, she did not erase the calculations. She left them where they were. As the light faded further and the monastery settled into its evening stillness, Sister Mary Catherine found herself confronting a question she had not anticipated when she began examining the Bible. Not what the markings meant, but whether she had a responsibility to understand them. Her vocation had been shaped by withdrawal, by a deliberate turning away from worldly conflict in favor of contemplation and service, yet it had never been rooted in ignorance or avoidance of truth. The idea that something intentionally hidden might be passing through her hands without examination unsettled her more deeply than the possibility of what that hidden thing might be. She considered the weight of her choice carefully, aware that to continue this line of inquiry was to step, however slightly, beyond the boundaries she had chosen for her life. But to stop now, knowing that something did not fit, felt equally irresponsible. The bell for Vespers rang, its sound echoing through the stone corridors above, and for the first time that day, Sister Mary Catherine did not rise immediately. She remained seated, her eyes moving slowly between the Bible and her notebook, as though waiting for one to reveal something the other concealed. Eventually, she closed both, aligning them neatly on the desk, and extinguished the lamp, leaving the library in its familiar twilight. She would return to this tomorrow, she told herself, with a clearer mind and rested eyes. Yet even as she joined the other sisters in prayer that evening,
Her thoughts drifted repeatedly back to the faint impressions on the page, to the stubborn refusal of the words to make sense, and to the growing realization that whatever their purpose, it was not accidental. That night, sleep came slowly, not because of fear, but because of unresolved questions that refused to settle.
She found herself replaying the afternoon's work in her mind, reviewing the lists, the numbers, the failed attempts, and the persistent absence of meaning, aware that such absence often signaled not error, but incompleteness. She did not yet understand what she was looking at, but she understood enough to know that the markings had been designed to be overlooked, and that noticing them, once done, carried its own quiet burden. By morning, she resolved, she would approach the problem again, not as a librarian cataloging an anomaly, but as an analyst confronting a system whose logic lay just beyond immediate reach. She did not know that this resolve marked the true beginning of her involvement, not merely with a peculiar book, but with a hidden network of intention that extended far beyond the monastery walls. For now, all she knew was that the Bible on her desk was no longer just a donated volume. It was a question, and questions, once asked, rarely remain confined to the place where they first arise. Sister Mary Catherine returned to the basement library the next morning with a steadiness that did not come from confidence but from discipline, because discipline was what remained when certainty was absent, and the mind still demanded an answer. The monastery had already settled into its familiar rhythm, the early prayers completed, the corridors above returning to their quiet routine, and the faint smell of candle wax drifting downward, as though even the air carried the memory of devotion. In the library, the Bible lay exactly where she had left it, closed and aligned with the edge of her desk with the same neatness she applied to every object she touched, and beside it sat her notebook, filled with a list that still refused to make sense, a list that had followed her through the night like a question she could not silence. She adjusted the lamp again, not because the light was insufficient, but because she had learned that with faint markings the angle mattered more than the brightness, and as she opened the Bible she felt the same small pressure in her chest that had returned each time she confronted the underlined words. She told herself, as she had told herself the day before, that her task was not to imagine meaning, but to test structure, because structure revealed intention, and intention, once confirmed, created obligation. She began by doing what she had not done yesterday, because yesterday had been dominated by discovery and accumulation, while today would be dominated by verification, and verification required certainty about what was real. She went back through the Bible page by page and checked every word she had recorded, comparing her notes to the faint impressions on the paper, correcting small errors where she had mistaken a light indentation for a mark, and adding a few words she had missed when fatigue blurred her attention late in the evening.
This work took hours, and she did not resent it, because she knew that a single incorrect entry could turn an entire pattern into nonsense, and nothing was more dangerous, in her mind, than mistaking her own error for the absence of logic. By midday, her list was longer and cleaner, the entries sharper, the references more precise, and yet the same fundamental problem remained, because the words still refused to resolve into any coherent sequence. She stared at the notebook for several minutes, not in despair, but in concentration, and then she did something she had avoided yesterday because it felt too close to speculation. She began to assume, provisionally and with caution, that the markings were a system, and that the words were not the message themselves, but components, like tiles in a mosaic that could only be seen when arranged correctly. She started with the simplest structural possibilities, because simple systems were often the most effective, and because anyone trying to conceal meaning would prefer a method that did not require complex tools. First, she tested alphabetical order again, but more thoroughly than before, rewriting the words onto separate slips of paper so she could rearrange them without rewriting entire pages. And she spread the slips across the desk in careful rows, watching for any accidental phrase or recognizable cluster. The result was predictably meaningless. Then she arranged the words by biblical book order, hoping that the sequence of books themselves might contain the key, as though the marked words were meant to be read from Genesis to Revelation in a hidden second narrative. For a brief moment she thought she saw something, because certain words seemed to sit beside each other with faint grammatical compatibility, but the illusion collapsed as soon as she expanded the sequence,
and she recognized that she was forcing coherence where none existed. Next, she tried grouping by verse, then by chapter, then by patterns of repetition, looking for a structural rhythm that might guide reading order, and each attempt ended in the same quiet outcome. The system resisted her. For the first time since the markings had revealed themselves, Sister Mary Catherine allowed the possibility that the problem itself had been misunderstood. She closed the notebook and left it untouched for several days, returning to her routine with deliberate focus, hoping that distance would dissolve the sense of order she feared she had imagined. When she finally opened it again, it was not with expectation, but with the quiet reluctance of someone prepared to accept that effort had led nowhere. Not violently, not dramatically, but patiently, like a locked door that did not move simply because someone wished it would.
By the time the afternoon light began to thin again and the heating pipes returned to their familiar knocking, Sister Mary Catherine had reached a point she recognized from scholarly work, a point where persistence could either become progress or become stubbornness, depending on whether she was willing to change the question. So she changed it. Instead of asking how the words should be read, she asked how the words could be retrieved without leaving obvious tracks, because the method of retrieval was often the method of concealment, and concealment was what these faint pencil impressions suggested most strongly. She looked again at the references in her notebook and focused on what had bothered her yesterday, the fact that the numbers themselves were scattered, not random but not sequential, and she considered the possibility that the numbers were not simply addresses but instructions. A book could function as a key in countless ways, and she had read enough historical accounts to know that texts had been used as covert reference systems for centuries, allowing people to communicate without writing full messages, relying instead on shared material and shared methodology. Her eyes moved slowly over the columns, and then, with a kind of cautious reluctance, she returned to the small calculations she had written the night before, the sums of chapter and verse. At first glance, the sums had not revealed anything, but perhaps the problem was not the sums themselves, but the way she had looked at them. She began to calculate the sum for every single entry, not sporadically, not as an experiment, but as a complete data set, and she did it the way her father once taught her to approach machine work, with patience and consistency, because a pattern could not reveal itself if the data were incomplete. For nearly an hour she wrote and calculated, her pencil moving steadily as she added numbers in the margin beside each word, and when she finished, she stared at the page for a long time, not because she immediately understood it, but because she could see something emerging that she could not yet name. Certain sums appeared more than once, not often, but enough to matter. Two entries might share the same sum even though they came from different books entirely, different contexts, different passages, as though the text were being used only as a container and the numeric relationship was the true structure. She circled the repeated sums and then began rewriting the entries again, this time grouping them by identical totals, placing each group on its own line. The list looked different now, not because meaning had appeared, but because organization had begun to replace scatter, and when scatter receded, intention became easier to detect.
Still, she resisted the temptation to declare victory, because grouping was not decoding. In any system could produce repeats by accident, especially when numbers were involved. So she tested it. She chose one sum that appeared twice, and placed the two corresponding words side by side. Then she chose another repeated sum, and placed its words beside each other as well. And she looked at the pairs, not as a reader seeking meaning, but as an analyst seeking plausibility. Some pairs were absurd, some were neutral, but a few, just a few, carried a strange sense of compatibility, as though they could belong together in a sentence if only more pieces were present. She felt the smallest shift in her posture, a sign not of excitement, but of attention sharpening, because attention was what preceded discovery in every intellectual endeavor she had ever known. To test the hypothesis further, she needed a way to create sequence, not just grouping, and she considered several possibilities, each one with its own risk of becoming an elaborate invention rather than a real method. She rejected anything that relied on subjective interpretation, because subjectivity was how people fooled themselves, and she refused to fool herself. Instead, she searched for a mechanical ordering principle that could be applied consistently and reproduced by someone else, because if this was a code, it had to be something that could be used reliably, not something that depended on a librarian's intuition in a monastery basement.
That was when she considered the simplest form of ordering available to her: ascending sums. If the sum of chapter and verse was the key, then perhaps the words were meant to be read from the lowest sum to the highest, forming a sequence constructed not by the Bible's narrative, but by arithmetic. It was elegant in a way that troubled her, because elegance often signaled design. She began again, rewriting the entire list once more, arranging the entries in order of their sums, and when sums repeated, she placed those entries beside each other on the same line, treating them as clustered units within the larger sequence. This process consumed the rest of the afternoon, because it required careful checking and rechecking, and because she refused to move quickly when she knew that haste was the enemy of accuracy. As she worked, the monastery above shifted toward evening prayer, the sound of footsteps faintly passing in the corridor, the bell calling the sisters to gather. And for the second day in a row, Sister Mary Catherine felt herself resisting the pull of routine, not because she rejected it, but because the task before her had acquired a weight she could not dismiss. She told herself she would go in a moment. She told herself she would finish this line. She told herself she would stop when she reached the end of the page.
And then, without warning, she reached a point in the ordered list where several words, placed together because the arithmetic demanded it, seemed to align in a way that was too coherent to ignore. It was not a full sentence, not a dramatic revelation, but it carried the unmistakable shape of information rather than random language, and the effect on her mind was immediate, like a door that did not fully open but shifted enough to reveal that it was not a wall. She stared at the words for a long moment, reading them again and again, checking her calculations to make sure she had not manipulated the sequence unconsciously. The numbers were correct, the ordering was correct, the clustering was mechanical, not interpretive, and yet the result felt directed. She moved her pencil downward, continuing to read through the next few entries in sequence, and as she did, the fragments began to accumulate, not as a single flowing narrative, but as the kind of clipped, compressed language one might expect from someone trying to convey meaning with limited space. The words did not speak like scripture. They spoke like shorthand. They spoke like notes. They spoke like instruction. She could not yet say what the message was, but she could say something else, something that settled in her stomach with a quiet heaviness. Someone had built this to be read. Someone had expected another person to reconstruct it, and that meant the Bible was not simply a book, it was a tool. Her first impulse was to close it, to stop, to return to the safety of routine, because the moment meaning appeared, the problem changed, and what had been an intellectual puzzle became a moral decision. She sat very still, listening to the muffled life of the monastery continuing above her, and she realized that the quiet of the library did not feel protective anymore, because what she held in her hands had been designed to survive quiet, designed to hide inside it, designed to pass unnoticed through places where no one was looking for such things. She thought of the donor, the deceased man whose estate had sent these boxes, and she felt a strange discomfort at the thought that she knew nothing about him beyond the official label attached to his name. Retired government official, generous donor, respectable life, the kind of man who could blend into any room without drawing attention, the kind of man whose books could arrive at a monastery without suspicion. The thought did not create fear in her, but it created a coldness, because it suggested that the system she was uncovering did not belong to academic eccentricity or private obsession, but to concealment with purpose.
She returned to the notebook and continued ordering the list, pushing further into the sequence. And the more she did, the more the fragments began to hint at a larger structure, references that appeared to relate not to faith, but to logistics, to movement, to access, to schedules, to places. She did not need to understand every word to recognize the tone. It was the tone of someone communicating operational details, not poetry, not devotion, not personal reflection, but the plain language of coordination. She felt her hands grow slightly colder as she wrote, and she recognized the sensation not as panic, but as the body's response to the mind's conclusion arriving before it could be fully spoken. This was not a harmless system. This was not a private puzzle. This was something built to function between people who expected secrecy. When the bell rang again, louder this time, calling the sisters to the next prayer, Sister Mary Catherine finally rose from her chair, not abruptly, but with the careful motion of someone stepping away from a table where something fragile and dangerous lay exposed. She closed the Bible and placed her notebook on top of it, aligning both neatly as though order could contain what she had found, and she extinguished the lamp, letting the library return to its dim twilight. As she walked toward the chapel, her steps were steady, but her mind was not, because her mind had crossed a threshold, and thresholds, once crossed, did not allow easy return. She sat among the other sisters in prayer, her face calm, her posture composed, and no one looking at her would have imagined that beneath the stillness, she was holding the weight of a discovery that no part of her life had prepared her to carry. Yet even as the prayers continued, she knew one thing with increasing clarity. If the sequence she had constructed was real, and if the Bible was what it now appeared to be, then this was not something she could simply file away, shelve, and forget. Because once a hidden system revealed itself, the person who found it became part of its story, whether they wished to be or not. And Sister Mary Catherine was beginning to understand that her quiet vocation, chosen to avoid the world's conflicts, might now require her to confront one directly, not with noise or drama, but with the same careful honesty that had guided her hands through every book she had ever touched. That evening, Sister Mary Catherine did not return to her cell with the relief that usually followed a day of orderly labor, because the work she had done in the library no longer felt complete in the way completed tasks usually did. Instead, it followed her.
It lingered in her thoughts as she walked the familiar corridors, as she listened to the low murmur of prayers, and as she lay awake long after the monastery had surrendered to sleep, aware that her mind was no longer circling a question, but orbiting a conclusion she was not yet ready to accept. She understood something now that she had not understood before. Discovery, once made, did not simply add knowledge, it imposed responsibility, and responsibility was heavier than curiosity had ever been. The next morning, she returned to the library, not to continue decoding, but to test herself, because before she could consider what to do with what she had found, she needed to be certain that she had not deceived herself into seeing order where none existed. She approached the Bible again, this time with deliberate skepticism, reading through several of the marked passages in isolation, forcing herself to confront how meaningless the individual words appeared when separated from the system she had imposed upon them. If the markings were nothing more than coincidence, then the sequence she had constructed would collapse under scrutiny. She hoped, quietly and without pride, that it would. But as she retraced her steps, rechecked her calculations, and repeated the ordering process from the beginning without consulting her previous notes, the same structure emerged again, indifferent to her doubts and resistant to reinterpretation. The numbers aligned the same way. The clusters formed in the same places. The fragments, when read in ascending order, carried the same compressed tone of coordination and intent. She closed the notebook slowly, acknowledging what her discipline no longer allowed her to deny. This system was reproducible, which meant it was real. Still, she resisted the urge to draw conclusions beyond what the evidence allowed, because while the structure now appeared intentional, intention alone did not define purpose, and she needed to be careful not to assign meaning prematurely. She asked herself questions the way scholars had taught her to do, not to seek reassurance, but to expose weakness. Could this be a personal mnemonic system? Could it be an academic experiment abandoned midstream? Could it be a private obsession with numbers, untethered from any real-world function? Each possibility dissolved under examination, not dramatically, but quietly, because none of them explained the extraordinary restraint with which the markings had been made, nor the effort invested in ensuring they remained invisible to casual inspection. Whoever had created this system expected the Bible to be examined. They simply expected that no one would look closely enough. As the morning wore on, Sister Mary Catherine found her thoughts drifting away from the mechanics of the code and towards something more unsettling, something she had resisted since the beginning.
The identity of the man who had owned the Bible. She knew little about him beyond the sparse details provided with the donation, yet those details now carried weight because they framed the context in which the system had been created. He had been a government official.
He had traveled. He had collected books with professional seriousness, and he had chosen, deliberately, to leave this particular volume behind. She wondered for the first time whether that choice had been intentional, whether the Bible had been meant to arrive here, in a place where no one would think to look for secrets, or whether its presence was merely the final accident of a life interrupted. The thought disturbed her because it suggested planning beyond what she could see, layers of intention nested within one another, each dependent on silence and assumption. It was then that the question she had avoided since the breakthrough finally demanded attention, not as an abstract dilemma, but as a personal one. What did she do now? She found herself wishing, not for certainty, but for error, hoping that someone else might uncover the truth instead of her, so that responsibility could pass without requiring her consent. Her vocation had been shaped by withdrawal, by a conscious decision to step away from political conflict and worldly struggle in order to serve through contemplation, preservation, and quiet discipline. She had not taken vows to solve crimes or expose wrongdoing. And yet she had also not taken vows to ignore truth when it presented itself, especially when that truth appeared to have been deliberately hidden. She felt the tension between these commitments with increasing clarity, aware that neither offered a comfortable escape from the choice now forming before her. To do nothing would preserve her routine, her peace, and the boundaries she had chosen for her life. But to do nothing would also mean allowing a system designed for concealment to remain intact, unexamined, and potentially active. She did not yet know what harm it might represent, but she knew enough to suspect that harm was not theoretical. She sought counsel, but not in the way one might expect. She did not speak to the other sisters. She did not consult outside authority. Instead, she turned inward, examining her reasoning with the same rigor she applied to manuscripts and catalogs, asking whether her hesitation came from prudence or fear, and whether her desire to act came from responsibility or imagination. She tested her motives repeatedly, and found to her discomfort that they remained consistent. She was not driven by curiosity anymore. She was driven by the knowledge that systems built to hide information were rarely benign, and that silence in such cases was rarely neutral. By the time the bell rang from midday prayer, her internal debate had narrowed to a single unresolved point.
If she was to act, she could not act alone. And acting alone did not mean exposing the discovery publicly, but rather placing it in the hands of someone capable of determining its significance without relying on her interpretation. The problem was deciding who that someone should be. The local authorities, she knew, would likely dismiss her concerns, interpreting them as the over-analysis of a cloistered librarian unaccustomed to the realities of modern governance. Academic institutions would approach the matter too slowly, if at all, bound by peer review and caution, and ill-equipped to handle something that might extend beyond scholarship. There remained one institution whose mandate included hidden systems, concealed communication, and the quiet evaluation of threats that did not announce themselves openly. The thought of contacting such an institution filled her with a subtle but undeniable anxiety, not because she feared authority, but because it represented a permanent crossing of the boundaries she had spent her life maintaining. Once involved, she would not be able to return to ignorance. Once spoken, the discovery would no longer belong to her. She understood that instinctively. Before making any decision, she resolved to do one final thing. Not to advance the decoding, but to document it with absolute clarity, so that if she did bring it forward, the evidence would speak for itself. She spent the rest of the afternoon rewriting her notes, organizing them into a clean sequence that demonstrated the process step by step, recording not only what worked but what failed, because failed attempts were proof of discipline rather than confusion. She noted her assumptions. She recorded her calculations. She left nothing to memory. By evening, the notebook had become something different from a personal record. It had become a method, one that another mind could follow, one that did not require belief, only repetition. As she closed the notebook, she realized that the act of preparing it had already answered her question, because people who intended to do nothing did not take such care to make their work legible to others. She had chosen, whether consciously or not, to move forward. That night, she slept little. Not because of fear, but because of anticipation, the kind that accompanies irreversible decisions rather than dramatic danger. She understood now that whatever lay ahead would not involve confrontation or spectacle, but patience, restraint, and the willingness to allow others to test what she had found.
She did not imagine arrests or revelations. She imagined questions, doubt, verification, the slow machinery of authority turning, if it turned at all. And in that imagined future, she saw herself not as a protagonist, but as a witness, someone whose role was not to interpret meaning, but to present evidence and step aside.
By morning, she knew what she would do. She would not accuse. She would not speculate. She would not frame her discovery as a conclusion. She would present it as a system, and she would allow those trained to evaluate such systems to decide what it represented. As the monastery stirred awake once more, Sister Mary Catherine prepared herself to take a step she had never expected to take, one that would quietly draw the outside world into a place designed to remain apart from it. She did not yet know how that world would respond, but she knew with calm certainty that silence was no longer an option. Sister Mary Catherine did not act immediately the next morning, not because her resolve had weakened, but because she understood that some decisions gain strength from restraint rather than urgency, and that haste, even when motivated by responsibility, could undo the care with which the discovery itself had been made. Instead of returning directly to the library, she attended the early prayers as usual, taking her place among the other sisters with the same composed posture she had maintained for years, aware that nothing in her outward appearance betrayed the fact that her life had quietly crossed into unfamiliar territory. The prayers unfolded with their familiar cadence, voices rising and falling in unison, and as she spoke the words she had spoken countless times before, she found that they carried a different weight now, not because their meaning had changed, but because she understood more clearly than ever that truth, once recognized, demanded action even when that action threatened the comfort of silence. When the service concluded, she did not return to the library. She went instead to the small administrative wing of the monastery, to a narrow corridor that few visitors ever entered, and stopped before a plain wooden door that bore no title, no narration, and no indication of the authority it concealed. Behind that door was Mother Bernadette. Mother Bernadette had led the monastery for more than 15 years, guiding the community through wartime uncertainty, post-war scarcity, and the slow return of stability that followed, and she carried her authority not through command or display, but through an unshakable calm that discouraged both panic and speculation. At 73 years old, she had lived long enough to recognize the difference between disruption and necessity, and she had learned that the most consequential decisions were often made quietly, without witnesses or ceremony. Sister Mary Catherine knocked once, softly, and waited. When the door opened, she was met with the familiar, steady gaze of a woman who had learned to listen without interrupting, and who rarely asked questions before hearing everything that needed to be said. Mother Bernadette gestured for her to enter, closing the door behind them with deliberate care, as though instinctively understanding that what was about to be discussed did not belong in the open corridors of the monastery. They sat across from one another at a small desk worn smooth by decades of use, the room lit by a single lamp that cast gentle shadows on the walls, and for a moment neither spoke, allowing the quiet to settle naturally rather than forcing it aside. When Sister Mary Catherine finally began, she did not frame her words dramatically, nor did she attempt to persuade. She described what she had found with the same measured clarity she would have used to explain a cataloging error or a damaged manuscript, laying out the sequence of discovery step by step, from the faint pencil impressions to the numerical ordering, from the failed attempts to the reproducible structure that had emerged despite her doubts. She showed Mother Bernadette the notebook, opening it to the first page, and then the next, allowing the process to speak for itself without interpretation or conclusion. Mother Bernadette listened without interruption, her hands folded calmly before her expression unchanged, as she followed the method rather than the implication. And when Sister Mary Catherine finished, the silence that followed was long, unbroken, and deliberate. At last, Mother Bernadette reached for the notebook herself. She did not read it quickly. She read it the way she did everything else, with patience and attention, pausing often, not to question, but to absorb. When she finally looked up, her voice, when she spoke, was neither alarmed nor dismissive, but thoughtful, in a way that suggested she had already begun weighing consequences rather than possibilities. She did not ask whether Sister Mary Catherine was certain. She asked whether the process could be repeated, whether another person, following the same steps, would arrive at the same structure, whether the system relied on interpretation or arithmetic.
Sister Mary Catherine answered each question plainly, grateful for the clarity of the inquiry, because these were the same questions she had asked herself, and hearing them spoken aloud confirmed that she had not been alone in her reasoning. Mother Bernadette nodded slowly, as though confirming something internally, and then asked one final question, the one that mattered most. Had anyone else seen the Bible? Had anyone else been told? Sister Mary Catherine answered no. Only the two of them were aware. The older woman closed the notebook gently and rested her hand upon it, not possessively, but with a quiet authority that carried both responsibility and resolve. The monastery, Mother Bernadette reminded her, had always maintained a position of distance from political power, not because it rejected the world, but because it served it best through neutrality and preservation.
However, neutrality, she added, did not mean indifference, and it did not absolve them of responsibility when something entrusted to their care suggested deliberate harm. If the system Sister Mary Catherine had uncovered was what it appeared to be, then ignoring it would not preserve the monastery's integrity, but compromise it. At the same time, she cautioned against assumption, emphasizing that their role was not to judge intent, but to ensure that the discovery reached those capable of evaluating it properly. The question, then, was not whether to act, but how. Mother Bernadette rose from her chair and moved toward the window, looking out at the quiet grounds of the monastery, where nothing appeared to have changed, where the world remained still and undisturbed, as though unaware of the decision forming within these walls. After a moment, she turned back and spoke with the quiet certainty that came from decades of leadership. The monastery would not contact civil authorities directly. It would not invite attention. It would not frame the discovery as accusation. Instead, she would reach out through the established ecclesiastical channels, discreetly and without detail, to a trusted figure within the church hierarchy who maintained long-standing communication with government institutions in Washington. Such contact, she explained, would allow the matter to be evaluated without spectacle, preserving discretion while ensuring that the information reached those trained to assess its significance. If the system proved meaningless, it would disappear quietly. If it proved dangerous, it would be addressed without drawing the monastery into public view. Sister Mary Catherine listened, feeling a subtle release of tension she had not fully recognized until that moment, because the burden of decision no longer rested on her alone. She had not escaped responsibility. She had shared it. The next steps unfolded slowly, deliberately, without visible drama. Mother Bernadette drafted a letter that revealed nothing explicit, referring only to a donated volume containing unusual markings that warranted professional evaluation, and requesting guidance on appropriate handling. The letter was sealed, sent through trusted hands, and then the monastery returned, outwardly, to its routine. Days passed. The library remained quiet. The Bible remained locked away, untouched. Sister Mary Catherine continued her work as she always had, cataloging books, preserving pages, and maintaining order, aware that beneath the surface something had been set in motion that could not be undone. She did not know who would receive the letter. She did not know how long the response would take. She knew only that the silence that followed was no longer passive, but expectant.
When the response finally came, it arrived without announcement, without insignia, and without explanation, in the form of a request delivered through the same discreet channels that had carried the letter outward. 2 individuals, the message said, wished to visit the monastery. They would identify themselves upon arrival. They asked only that the volume in question and any associated notes be made available. No urgency was expressed, no conclusions were stated, but the request itself carried a weight that neither woman could mistake. Mother Bernadette informed Sister Mary Catherine of the message with the same calm she had shown throughout, though her eyes lingered for a moment longer than usual, acknowledging without words that the threshold they had approached was now behind them. The monastery had done what it could. The rest would belong to others. And somewhere beyond the stone walls, the quiet machinery of a different kind of authority had begun to turn. Days passed without response. Then weeks. The monastery heard nothing further, and for a time Sister Mary Catherine allowed herself to believe that the matter might quietly dissolve into bureaucracy, absorbed by caution and forgotten amid more immediate concerns. Life resumed its familiar patterns. The library returned to its predictable stillness. The notebook remained untouched, no longer a problem demanding resolution, but a question suspended without answer. She told herself that this silence was likely intentional, that discretion often looked like delay, and that not every discovery demanded consequence. It was only later, when she had begun to accept that nothing more would come of it, that the request finally arrived.
The men arrived without ceremony on a gray afternoon that looked no different from any other, their presence announced not by sirens or uniforms, but by a brief, quiet exchange at the monastery gate that few sisters noticed and none understood. They did not introduce themselves publicly. They were escorted inward by Mother Bernadette with the same composed courtesy she offered to any visitor, though the deliberate pace of her steps reflected an understanding that what they carried with them was not luggage, but authority exercised discreetly. They were shown into the parlor reserved for private meetings, a room chosen precisely because it reflected the monastery's values, austere, orderly, and free of ornament, where nothing distracted from conversation and nothing invited speculation. Sister Mary Catherine entered last, her notebook held close but not clutched, aware that from this moment forward the discovery she had made would no longer belong solely to her discipline or her conscience. The two men could not have been more different in demeanor, though both wore the same unremarkable suits and carried themselves with the controlled reserve of people accustomed to being unnoticed.
The older of the two spoke first. He introduced himself politely, his voice even and professional, and thanked the monastery for its cooperation, explaining only that they had been asked to evaluate a matter involving a donated volume, and that their role was limited to determining whether further review was necessary. His tone carried no hint of urgency, no hint of expectation. The younger man said nothing at all. He remained seated slightly back from the table, his posture relaxed but attentive, his eyes moving quietly between Sister Mary Catherine, the notebook, and the closed Bible resting on the table, as though he were cataloging impressions rather than listening for conclusions. Sister Mary Catherine noticed immediately that he did not look at the Bible as an object of reverence or curiosity. He looked at it as a container. Mother Bernadette spoke briefly, explaining the circumstances of the donation and the reason for concern, without offering interpretation, and then she gestured toward Sister Mary Catherine, allowing the work to speak through the person who had done it. Sister Mary Catherine began where she always began, not with what she believed, but with what she had observed, describing the faint markings, the method of discovery, and the steps she had taken to rule out coincidence. She did not claim significance. She did not speculate about intent. She described process. The older man listened with a faint tightening around his eyes, a subtle signal of skepticism rather than interest, and when she finished, he leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table, as though preparing to dismantle what he had just heard. He asked his questions carefully, but they were pointed. Had she considered that the markings might be random? Had she accounted for confirmation bias? Had she tested whether alternative numerical arrangements produced similar results? His tone was not dismissive, but it carried the practiced caution of someone who had heard many convincing theories that collapsed under scrutiny. Sister Mary Catherine answered each question calmly, explaining her failed attempts, her repetition of the process from scratch, and the consistency of the outcome, regardless of starting point. She did not defend herself. She clarified. The younger man remained silent. He did not interrupt. He did not challenge. But he leaned forward now, just slightly, his gaze fixed not on Sister Mary Catherine's face, but on her notebook, as though he were less interested in her confidence than in her restraint. At one point he reached for the notebook himself, asking permission with a glance rather than a word, and when she nodded, he turned the pages slowly, not reading everything, but scanning for structure. He paused at the sections detailing failed attempts, then again at the reordered lists, his expression unchanged, but his attention unmistakable.
The older man, noticing this, shifted his focus back to the Bible. He opened it with a careful neutrality that avoided both reverence and suspicion, flipping through the pages quickly at first, then more slowly as the faint markings became apparent under the light. He frowned, not in alarm but in concentration, and adjusted the lamp instinctively, as though accustomed to searching for things meant to remain unseen. When he spoke again, his skepticism had not disappeared, but it had softened. Still, he cautioned against premature conclusions, reminding both women that pattern recognition was a powerful instinct, and that powerful instincts could mislead even the most disciplined minds. He added, almost dismissively, that similar cases had often turned out to be nothing more than academic curiosity, systems that appeared deliberate only because the human mind insisted on finding order where none had been intended. It was the younger man who spoke next, breaking his silence for the first time. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, and he did not address the conclusion at all. Instead, he asked a single, precise question. Had Sister Mary Catherine allowed anyone else to see the Bible after the discovery?
The question was not accusatory, it was logistical. She answered no. Only Mother Bernadette had been informed. The younger man nodded once, as though confirming an internal checklist, and then asked another question, just as calmly. Had the Bible been examined under different lighting conditions, different times of day, different angles? Sister Mary Catherine answered that it had. The faintness of the markings, she explained, suggested deliberate concealment rather than casual notation. The younger man said nothing more, but his silence carried a different weight now, one that contrasted sharply with the older man's continued caution. After several minutes, the older man summarized their position carefully, stating that while the findings were intriguing, they did not yet constitute proof of malicious intent, and that many systems could appear meaningful under repeated examination. He emphasized that their responsibility was not to validate theories, but to assess risk, and at present, the risk remained undefined. Mother Bernadette accepted this without argument, her expression unchanged, as though she had expected nothing else. Sister Mary Catherine felt no disappointment, because she had not come seeking validation, she had come seeking evaluation. It was the younger man who altered the course of the meeting, not by contradicting his colleague, but by reframing the matter entirely.
He suggested, quietly and without emphasis, that before dismissing the system as benign, it might be useful to test whether the ordering principle produced information that could not plausibly arise by chance, particularly if the vocabulary suggested functional rather than devotional language. The room fell briefly silent. "A notebook," he said, "for further review. There would be no promises, no timelines, and no assumptions, but the material warranted closer examination. The transfer was handled without drama. Receipts were written, conditions were noted. The Bible was placed carefully into a plain case that revealed nothing of its contents or significance. Sister Mary Catherine watched as it was lifted from the table, aware that she might never see it again, and that the work she had done now existed beyond her reach, subject to processes she could not influence. The younger man met her gaze briefly as they prepared to leave, offering no reassurance, but something else instead, a recognition that suggested he understood the nature of her caution and the discipline with which he had approached the problem. When the door closed behind them and their footsteps faded down the corridor, the parlor returned to its quiet stillness, as though nothing had occurred. Yet the absence they left behind felt different from ordinary quiet. It felt active, charged, as though something had been removed not just from the room, but from the future. Mother Bernadette said little as they stood together, only reminding Sister Mary Catherine that whatever followed was no longer theirs to carry alone. The monastery would remain as it always had been, she said, and that constancy was not denial, but strength. Sister Mary Catherine nodded, grateful for the simplicity of the words, because simplicity was what she needed now. As she returned to the library later that day, the empty space on her desk where the Bible had rested felt heavier than the book itself ever had, because absence, she realized, could carry meaning as surely as presence. She resumed her work, cataloging and preserving as before, yet with an awareness that something irreversible had occurred, not loudly, not visibly, but with the quiet certainty that accompanied decisions made carefully and without witness. Whatever judgment would be rendered beyond these walls, whatever conclusions others might draw, she knew that the discovery had reached the point where silence would no longer protect anyone, and that knowledge, once shared, could not be taken back.
After the visitors left, life inside St. Bartholomew's Monastery returned, outwardly, to its familiar rhythm, as though nothing had crossed its threshold, and no quiet decision had set anything in motion beyond its walls. The bells continued to mark the hours. The corridors remained silent. The library resumed its orderly stillness. And yet, for Sister Mary Catherine, something had shifted in a way that could not be catalogued or shelved, because once a truth left one's hands, its absence carried a weight of its own. The Bible did not return. No explanation was offered. No request followed. No questions came back through the same discreet channels that had carried it away. Weeks passed without incident, and then months, and in that time, Sister Mary Catherine learned something she had never needed to learn before, which was how to live with uncertainty, not as a lack of resolution, but as a form of knowledge. She understood now that most consequences in the Cold War did not arrive with announcements or headlines, but with subtle adjustments that only mattered to those who knew where to look. It began quietly, not with information delivered to the monastery, but with small, indirect signals that reached her awareness only because she had learned to notice absence as carefully as presence.
A scholarly journal that had arrived regularly for years stopped coming without explanation. A correspondence from a Catholic university was delayed indefinitely and never resumed. A familiar name that had appeared consistently in government bulletins simply vanished from circulation. None of these changes meant anything on their own, but together they suggested movement, the kind of movement that did not seek attention. Sister Mary Catherine did not ask questions. She did not inquire. She did not attempt to follow threads that had clearly been designed to disappear once pulled. She understood that the role she had played had ended the moment she handed over her notebook, because whatever followed required distance, not involvement, and silence, not confirmation. Yet there were moments, brief and unspoken, when meaning pressed close enough to be felt. A casual remark from a visiting priest about new security considerations affecting archival access. A passing reference to facilities being reorganized, schedules revised, procedures quietly tightened. No details were offered, no explanations were given, but the tone had changed, and tone, she had learned, often revealed more than facts. One afternoon, nearly a year after the Bible had left the monastery, Mother Bernadette received a brief visit from a man whose name was never recorded in the guest ledger. He stayed less than an hour. No documents were exchanged. No discussion took place in Sister Mary Catherine's presence.
When the man departed, Mother Bernadette returned to her office and resumed her work without comment, as though the visit had been administrative rather than consequential. That evening, as the two women crossed paths in the corridor outside the library, Mother Bernadette paused briefly and said only this: "You did what you were meant to do. Nothing more. Nothing less." Sister Mary Catherine did not ask for clarification. She understood that clarification was not something that could be safely given. Over time, the sense of immediacy faded, replaced by a quieter awareness that whatever had been uncovered had been absorbed into processes far larger and slower than individual lives. She imagined desks cleared quietly, files reclassified, conversations that never happened again. She imagined people reassigned without explanation, projects paused without justification, and routines altered just enough to prevent something unseen from continuing as it once had. She did not imagine arrests or confrontations because she understood that the most effective outcomes of intelligence work were often indistinguishable from coincidence to everyone except those who needed to know. In the Cold War, success rarely looked like victory. It looked like absence. Sister Mary Catherine returned fully to her work, and in doing so, she discovered that the library felt subtly different now, not because anything in it had changed, but because she had. Each book that passed through her hands reminded her that texts were never neutral objects, and that the meaning they carried depended as much on intention as on content. She became more attentive, not suspicious, but alert in a way that did not seek danger, yet did not shy away from it either. She never found another marked Bible. She never uncovered another hidden system, but she remained aware that vigilance did not always announce itself as urgency, and that responsibility could exist quietly, embedded in routine rather than imposed by crisis. Years later, long after the Cold War had begun to shift towards its eventual conclusion, Sister Mary Catherine received a final reminder of what had once passed through her hands. The notebook she had compiled during those winter days was returned to her without explanation, its pages intact, its contents unchanged, and its significance unspoken. There was no note attached, no acknowledgement, only the quiet implication that what it contained was no longer considered active. She placed the notebook back in her desk drawer, where it remained untouched for the rest of her life, not as a relic of achievement, but as a reminder of the moment when attention had mattered. In the final years of her service, as she moved more slowly through the library she had preserved for decades, Sister Mary Catherine often reflected on how easily the Bible might have passed unnoticed through her hands, catalogued, shelved, and forgotten, like countless others before it. Another librarian might have missed the markings entirely. Another might have dismissed them. Another might have noticed, but chosen silence. What mattered, she came to understand, was not that she had solved a mystery, but that she had recognized a system designed to remain unseen, and had refused to look away once she understood what it was. History, she believed,
was shaped not only by leaders and declarations, but by individuals who noticed what others overlooked, and who acted not for recognition, but because responsibility left them no alternative. The Cold War had been fought in shadows, through codes, silence, and misdirection, and most of its victories would never be recorded in textbooks or celebrated publicly. But somewhere within those unseen outcomes, she knew, was the quiet consequence of a decision made in a basement library by someone who had chosen a life of stillness and yet had been called, once, to act. And that, she believed, was enough.